Hello, my name is Michelle Ramirez. I'm a medical anthropologist, and I'll be discussing how different social structures make particular segments of the population more vulnerable to HIV/AIDS. Or put in the language of public health, how particular segments of our population are actually at greater risk for HIV/AIDS than others. As a medical anthropologist with public health training, I understand that risk factors for HIV/AIDS are not merely biological, but also social in origin. In this first part of our discussion, I'll be focusing primarily on gender, structural violence, and AIDS in the United States. Later, we'll examine how structural violence plays a part in the AIDS pandemic in other parts of the world. So as mentioned earlier by Dr. Kevin Murphy, sex and gender are two separate concepts according to social scientists. Sex refers to biological attributes such as genitalia and secondary sex characteristics, while gender is fundamentally a cultural construct. It is the perception of self that is strongly influenced by culturally based notions of masculinity and femininity, traits that culture assigns to men and women. So we can think of this primarily as sex being biological and gender being social. And if we want to delve further into gender, we can think of gender roles, gender stereotypes. Gender roles are things like activities our culture assigns to the sexes, whereas gender stereotypes are oversimplified but strongly held ideas about characteristics of males and females. But perhaps most important for our discussion today is the concept of gender stratification. And with gender stratification, we're talking about unequal distribution of rewards, socially valued resources, power, prestige, personal freedom between men and women that reflect their different positions in the social hierarchy. Now, if I were to ask you, who in society do you think has more access to valuable social resources? Do you think you would pick men, or do you think you might pick women? So when I pose that question to my students, they generally say men, and I certainly agree with them, but let's not just go with our feeling about this. Let's look at some actual data. In the United States, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, women earn 81% of what men earn, or on average, women earn nearly 20% less than what men earn. And another rather daunting statistic is that women account for 85% of the victims in intimate partner violence, men for approximately 15%. So one's gender shapes opportunities and constraints in the world. Although social scientists again argue that gender isn't the only aspect of life that can influence a person's access to the valued goods and resources of a particular society. What other social characteristics in our society do you think influence a person's access to valued resources? Race, social class, age, sexual orientation, or maybe you think all of the above? Well, if you picked all of the above, you are certainly in agreement with many social scientists who claim that race, class, and gender operate together in structuring opportunities and constraints within a given society. According to Margaret Anderson and Patricia Hill Collins, race, class, and gender are intersecting categories of experience that affect all of human life. At any moment, race, class, or gender may feel more salient or meaningful, but they are overlapping and cumulative in the effects on people's experiences. And the authors actually call this a matrix of domination as a way to examine the multiple interlocking levels of domination that stem from a particular society's configuration of race, class, and gender. And you can see here we've rendered what we think of could be a matrix of domination with race, age, among others in this matrix, and you might even be able to think of more circles that would be included in this matrix of domination. Now, if I were to ask you which race in the United States has more access to valued goods and resources, which one might you pick? We know as anthropologists that race is culturally constructed, so these are the categories in our society: Black, white, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, Native American. Which would you pick as the group that has the most access to valued goods and resources? Well, again, if you picked white, your answer is certainly in line with national data. According to the Pew Research Center, the median wealth of white households is now 20 times that of black households and 18 times that of Hispanic households. From 2005 to 2009, inflation-adjusted median wealth fell by 66% among Hispanic households and 53% among black households, compared with just 16% among white households. And after this presentation, I encourage you to link out to the Pew report that will give you more precise information about this gap, this wealth gap that is the biggest since the government began publishing this kind of data. So bearing in mind that historically black people were literally denied loans to purchase homes in suburban areas, a well-documented practice of redlining kept poor black people concentrated in urban neighborhoods. Again, after the presentation, I encourage you to look at a film clip from a PBS special that examines this process of redlining and racially segregated neighborhoods very, very specifically. Many argue, therefore, that in the United States, we claim to provide equality for all, but rather unfortunately, we live in a society that isn't structured equally. And this unequal structure, which provides advantages for some and disadvantages others, has been called a system of structural violence. The idea of structural violence was first discussed by a Norwegian sociologist named Johan Galtung. And according to Galtung, it is a preventable harm or damage where there is no actor committing the violence. Such violence emerges from the unequal distribution of power and resources. Or in other words, it is said to be built into a given society's structures and institutions. Other authors describe structural violence as the physical and psychological harm that results from exploitative and unjust social, political, and economic systems. So factors such as a disproportionate burden of poverty, racism, and gender inequality are thought by many researchers to be a form of structural violence. Again, where there is no particular actor that's committing this violence, but that the violence and harm are built into the social system. So what does all of this have to do with AIDS? Well, rather unfortunately, structural violence is the system in which the AIDS virus lurks. So bearing in mind that the poverty rate is higher among African Americans than for any other race, 28% approximately, African Americans accounted for an estimated 44% of all new HIV infections among adults and adolescents aged 13 years and older, despite representing only 12 to 14% of the U.S. population. Now, when you look at the CDC graph, you'll note that actually white men have a larger percentage of the new infection rate, but that makes sense because white people are 63.4% of the U.S. population. With black folks only being 12 to 14% of the U.S. population, the numbers are disproportionate. They are disproportionately represented in these AIDS statistics. In 2010, the fourth largest number of all new HIV infections among all people in the United States occurred among black African American women with heterosexual contact. And here's another graph that illustrates that particular point. So black and Latino women are disproportionately represented among those who live in poverty. And look at how the system of structural violence and the matrix of domination map on to AIDS risk. At some point in their lifetimes, an estimated 1 in 32 black or African American women will be diagnosed with an HIV infection, compared with 1 in 106 Hispanic or Latino women and 1 in 526 white women. So Hispanic women are a little more than 3 times more likely to get HIV/AIDS than white women, and black women are at 16 times greater risk for HIV/AIDS than white women. So why is this the case? Well, many social scientists have been working on this problem, and according to Robert Fullilove, Urban poverty in the United States has created the perfect machinery for the continued propagation of HIV. Inner-city poor neighborhoods often shelter a vigorous drug trade, numerous opportunities for strangers to engage in drug-mediated unprotected sex, and numerous locations where these and other risk behaviors go virtually unchallenged. Another prominent AIDS researcher, Brooke Shope, argues that macroeconomic conditions operating in a context of pervasive gender inequality have different effects upon the lives of women in different regional, class, and family circumstances. Different circumstances also produce different negotiating strengths among women as well as different HIV risks. So we know that having unprotected sex is a risk factor for HIV/AIDS. And unprotected vaginal sex puts women at a greater risk than men for HIV. And unprotected anal sex is riskier for women than unprotected vaginal sex. And condoms have been one of the major technologies promoted by public health agencies as a way to prevent the spread of HIV and AIDS. And many people know that condoms can prevent STDs, including HIV. But knowledge does not always lead to optimal health behaviors. In fact, there are a variety of structural constraints that interfere with condom use. For example, poor women who rely on men for material support may not be in a position to demand that her partner wear a condom, and may have less negotiating power in the kind of sex that she has with her male partner. Research has also shown that poor African American women may be reluctant to have their male partners use condoms based on their need or desire to maintain their ongoing relationship, and a fear that men might leave them because of the strong dislike of condoms. Additionally, women may risk being accused themselves of being the AIDS carriers or being too schooled sexually if they initiate condom use. And finally, it may actually be a signal that the woman is the one who has been unfaithful to her male partner if she suggests condom use. So anthropologists have led the way in examining the cultural meanings of sex and sexual practices in addition to the larger macrosocial system of structural violence in which these behaviors occur in order to develop more appropriate education and outreach to high-risk populations. So gender inequality really calls into question the utility of condoms in a setting in which a woman's ability to insist on safe sex is undermined by a host of less easily confronted forces, such as poverty. The wider political economy establishes the situations and restricts the options that people can choose as a means of survival. A focus on subcultures and on individual behaviors tends to obscure the underlying causes of social interaction and its effect on AIDS. Thus, I believe that Anderson and Hill Collins' model of the matrix of domination is particularly useful when attempting to understand how race, class, and gender interact to limit the choices of poor women of color and how this can ultimately inform their risk for HIV/AIDS. So in conclusion, focusing on individual behaviors only partially explains the racial and ethnic disparities in HIV transmission. It is clear that individual behavior takes place in social contexts where structural violence limits health-promoting behaviors such as condom use. However, organizations such as the National Minority AIDS Council have been working with faith-based and community organizations as well as AIDS service organizations that deliver HIV/AIDS services in communities of color nationwide. I encourage you to check out their website to see all of the various initiatives they have developed to help address this particular health disparity. Thank you.